Welcome to the Cyber Business Podcast, where we feature top founders and entrepreneurs and share their inspiring stories. Now, let's get started with the show.
Matthew Connor here, host of the Cyber Business Podcast, where we feature successful business leaders, authors, and more. Today, we are joined by the founder and CEO of AgencyAgile and the author of the Amazon best-selling book, Unmanaged, Jack Skeels. Jack, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me here, Matthew. Appreciate the opportunity to talk about things with you.
I'm glad you joined us. Before we get too far in, a quick word from our sponsors. This episode is brought to you by cyberlinks.com. That's cyberlynx.com. Do you know if a hacker's in your system? Most people and most companies don't until the hacker does whatever bad deed they came to do. With Cyberlink's intrusion detection, you'll know if a hacker finds its way past your security before they can do harm. Find out more at cyberlinks.com. That's cyberlynx.com. All right, and now back to our show. Jack, thanks for coming on today. Your book, Unmanaged, I was really, I don't want to say pleasantly surprised because that would suggest that I had low expectation, but I really absolutely loved it because there are just so many really cool kind of shocking things in there, I think, where you're like, oh yeah, of course. And it makes great sense. But for those who are not familiar, can you give them a little introduction into Unmanaged?
Sure. Thanks, Matthew. I think probably the easiest way to do that is to talk about what we were going to call the book, which originally was The Manager Tax. And we chose to not do that because it sounded so negative, right? And unmanaged sounded curiosity provoking, right? But at the end of the day, the core idea is this, that we as managers, especially in today's complex workplaces, actually often are more costly to productivity than we are additive to productivity. And it's not that that's not solvable, but it's certainly not solvable if you don't understand it. And so the book aims to help managers better understand how to be an aid and a multiplier to productivity rather than the inadvertent detractor from productivity, if you will.
No, 100%. Couldn't agree more. And, I'd like to go over that the manager tax, but first, the working title of the book. I love this. In the end notes, you say the working title of the book, how to run a fucking agency by the guy whom you said could not run an agency. Clearly, I was not unhinged at all. So I love that. I was like, yeah, that's a great working title. But let's talk manager tax, because I think that's a really great idea that I don't think every manager has kind of not necessarily has heard about. And I think it's one worth talking about. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, I think that a couple of things happened. One is there's a general idea that managers are a good thing, right? And that managing is good. And so if you look out there aren't many books. I looked at thousands of book titles, right? And there aren't many books that actually mention the idea that maybe managing isn't a good thing. And it isn't that it's right or wrong or good or bad or anything, but it was interesting, the polarity of that, right? And so in essence, that reflects something we've seen in the companies we've worked with, which is, and in managers in general, even myself, and I've got an interesting story as well, if we get to that, the idea that me being managerial is necessarily positive, right? Okay. That's that whole question. And the counterpoint, and I like to present these counterpoints because they're what turned me on as a reader, right? Is the question, is that true? And in fact, it's not, because I won a Nobel Prize over this idea. So, it's got to be pretty legit. And that is, the more you manage, the greater the managerial intensity inside of the company, the lower the relative productivity of the organization is. And this is from 1937, so it isn't even a new idea. And he won the Nobel Prize 54 years later, so it took a long time for everyone to admit it was true.
Right.
But and I can give you a really simple, I love this simple illustration that I've been doing lately with it. we take a traditional factory, and I'm a manager of a department. And back then, managing was simple in a way. I've got my department that we assemble widgets, just to use the classic thing. We assemble widgets, and my department is responsible for the process that makes 200 widgets a week, right? Okay. Now, if my team is getting 200 widgets done per week, I'm doing my job as a manager. That's how I get measured, right? Now, the problem is, what if I decide to go be managerial, right? And so I'm going to hold a department meeting for 2 hours where we talk about things, and this will make me feel like I'm doing something as a manager. But oops, we only deliver 188 widgets that week. And my boss calls and says, "What in the hell's going on in your department? You only delivered 188 widgets this week." And I said, "Well, I had to call a meeting." And my boss says, "Don't call any goddamn meetings, okay? Let people get the work done." Now,
Mhm.
there's a lot finer of a point on it back then, right? Because it was, if I did something that detracted from worker productivity, then it would show up in the numbers by which I and the whole department is measured. Today, we have the matrix organization, right? The fantastic multi-matrix organization where maybe any one of my people has sort of like me and then a bunch of other people that they're being managed by, right? And something interesting happens is that all of a sudden I don't get blamed for loss of productivity. We ended up blaming the workers for loss of productivity, right? So
Right.
if it didn't get done, it's Jonathan that didn't get it done, even though I had Jonathan in 7 meetings this week and let a bunch of other managers interrupt him and pull him to and fro. It's not, all I can do, in fact, a lot of managers do is they say, "Man, we just need better people. Jonathan just doesn't get it done." And Jonathan's not the problem. It's the way we manage that makes Jonathan have a much harder time getting his job done every day.
Couldn't agree more. In fact, I think it's really interesting because so many companies suffer from that. Once you get beyond that, just well, we're 4 or 5 people, and you can tell
Mhm.
that every meeting kind of was taken away from finite time. But as you get into that larger, messier kind of matrix, and you're no longer just producing a widget, it makes obvious sense. You tell a great story in the book about you're writing the book, I believe, at the time you're on an airplane, you sit down beside a guy who, you just gotten bumped up to first class. He's sitting there, he's working. He sees that you're, you know about Agile because the name of your agency is Agile Agency. Can you tell this story? Because I think it was such a great, powerful story.
Oh, cool. Yeah, one of my favorite ones. This guy he ran a shop, about 20 or so people in a field called CEDIA, a Consumer Electronics Design and Installation Association. So this is like if you want like a refrigerator to pop out of your bedroom floor when you clap your hands, kind of thing. So they do all kinds of weird stuff, and his team is 20 sort of MacGyvers, right? Oh, you want the curtains to close while music plays, that kind of thing. And so he looked at my PowerPoint slides and that kind of thing. And he said, "So can Agile help me?" And the answer is no, not really. But he had a much simpler problem than that. And the problem goes something like this. He had every week he's got to schedule these 20 MacGyvers with about 30 or 40 jobs, and they're all over. This is Los Angeles, all over Los Angeles, and movie stars' homes and all that kind of thing. And his problem was this: he would spend all day Sunday trying to create a schedule for what everyone should do, right? Because that's the manager's job, tying this back, right? Okay. And the problem was his schedule always sucked. Everyone hated it. Okay. And he hated that he destroyed it was his football Sunday, is what he was destroying, actually. He hated that. And he said, and then for all that work, everyone hates it and thinks whatever. I said, it's really easy. And he didn't realize what I was doing. I thought, it's not something you need to manage. You have, and you don't even need MacGyvers to do this, right? But you've got 20 people that are problem solvers that you can throw anything at. Why don't you throw this ridiculously simple task at them? And I told him to just write down all the jobs on little cards and put them on the conference table on Monday morning and tell them to work it out. And he wrote me an email, I don't know, 6, 8 weeks, something later. I didn't even remember him or anything, but it said, had the subject line, all caps, Agile works! Exclamation point, right? And what really happened, and what really happened here is he felt the need that this must be a manager thing that he had to do, and yet ignoring the fact that we as humans, all of us, are ridiculously good at scheduling and coordinating and thinking together as a group. And I just said, why don't you stop being a manager? I didn't say that to him, but that's really what I told him. I said, just stop being a manager. Let them know if they have any problems, they can call you. But otherwise, let them get it done. And he said everyone is so happy. People are getting everything done. They're getting done early with jobs, and they're loving it. Right. So that's that great example. I'm glad you picked that out.
Yeah.
Really cool validation of the idea. You don't have to be working in any sort of organization, but it's just really easy. He didn't have other managers he was even competing with, right? He was the manager, and yet he was overmanaging.
Yeah. I think it's just so prevalent and easily done. And you do a great job in the book of kind of explaining why that is, how we've gotten to this point, and how to kind of undo that. So I think this is such a great book for really all managers and business leaders, just at every level. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I mean, small business to Fortune, 10 companies. This is applicable. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that it's very applicable. I think that there are the ability to actually move the needle is probably inversely proportional to size. In other words, the part of it, and I go into this in section 5 of the book, your ability to be an unmanager is partly under your own control. And it's also subject to the working environment that you as the manager are in, right? If there is what can happen is you can get a culture of management that is, you better be managing, right? If you're not managing, then why am I paying you? Well, it's one of those Edison kind of stories. Is you're paying me to be there only at the moments when I need to be there, but that may not flow, right?
Yeah.
And the idea that maybe we have too many managers, which is often the case, is a challenge as well. It is. We've seen it applied in fairly large multi-thousand person organizations. I'm just wary of whatever's at the top of that organization. That ethos does trickle down, right? And not all CEOs, especially in large corporations, are necessarily all that benevolent versus just driven. Tell people what to do, get them driving. If I'm not seeing you basically interrupting them or whatever, then you're not doing your job. Yeah.
Oh no, 100%. Couldn't agree more. So you've got this book, which is fantastic. But you've also got your agent, Agile Agency. For those who aren't familiar with that, can you tell us a little bit about your company?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. This all came out of a moment earlier in my life where someone told me I didn't know how to run and lead an organization, and I'd been a researcher before that, and I decided I was going to go prove them wrong. And I was going to do that. And you mentioned the book, the title. It was an agency I was working for at the time. How to run your frickin' agency by the guy who you said couldn't run a frickin' agency, right? And I did all the research, and I'd worked at a think tank and everything. And what I discovered is that I didn't know how to run an organization. And that's really sort of the genesis of all of it from that perspective. And so I decided then that I couldn't write a book about something I'd never actually done, right? And so I started this company, and we've gone out, worked with over 200 organizations. We have like 90 net promoter score, all that kind of thing. Great reputation. And at some point, I said, well, "Okay, I think I know enough now." And that's the genesis of the book. Really was thinking I knew a lot, then thinking I knew a little, and now thank you to the many clients. I actually know a lot again. So
I love it. Well, let's dive in there a little bit because I do love the founder story, and even if it is because you wanted to prove the naysayers wrong, which is as good a reason as any. Can you kind of go into the details? Like, so you leave your company, you've got this idea to prove them wrong. Um, How did you go from idea to actual implementation? What's the story there?
Yeah. So that moment when I sat with all my diagrams, because when you're writing a book, you do diagrams, and I thought, oh my God, okay, well, I sucked as a manager. What am I going to do? I thought, well, I should go. I'd gotten laid off during the global economic downturn. And so I thought, I'll just go find a job. And I found a job. And the guy who I reported to is now my business partner. Actually,
Right.
I went, but I ended up at this agency where we had this really, and I go into this story in the book. It's a fun story. I can give your readers a link for the pre-read. There's a PDF online of that front section, a fun read. And it was a project that, if you've been in the world of projects, which most of us have, it's one of those classic ones where you know it's a disaster weeks or even months in advance, just because everything is always going wrong, right? And I discovered in this project, and now that we've got this theme of unmanaging and too many managers, a 15-person team with 7, 8, 9 managers for it. And that's a crazy ratio, right? I mean, that's like one manager for every 1 point something people. And my business partner reminded me, and I didn't even count him, that he was one of those managers too. So the count's even higher. And I basically got rid of most of the managers. I said, you guys can interact with them for a very limited time every week, but otherwise, let's let people get stuff done. I did this whole exercise trying out these ideas that come from Japanese management theory and all that kind of stuff. And lo and behold, the team pretty much got the whole project done. Nobody could believe it. And we cloned that model of doing it for a couple more projects. And they were, all three of those projects were the most successful projects that 90-person organization had that year.
Wow.
And much to the chagrin of the CEO there, I said, okay, gotta go. Gotta go do this. And that was the start of when I launched our company, AgencyAgile. Yeah.
That's fantastic. So, who's your target audience, or your kind of sweet spot, your customer for Agile agency?
One of the things that I have in the book, which is, I think, a really useful distinction for managers to think about, is the project-driven organization. In other words, organization whose main purpose is to do things that haven't been done before. Increasingly, this is the type of organizations we have. Marketing organizations, product development organizations, software development organizations. The business of doing something new is a whole different business than the business of doing something repetitive. And in that way, that Cedia installer company that I mentioned, they're a project-driven organization. They don't do the same thing twice. And when you get into those environments, there's an inadvertent shift to overmanaging the organization. And in fact, probably even less managing than a more traditional organization is a better thing as well. And this is really why I co-opted the term agile. A lot of your listeners will know agile from software agile, scrums and all that kind of thing. The real idea was that software agile had inside of it was, oh, let's just let the team figure it out and get the work done, right? And so I think that's the art that we've lost. And I talk a little bit about that in the book also. It was an artifact of the industrial era, right? In other words, back 200 years ago, if I was a manager, I wasn't really a manager. The word manager didn't even exist back then, by the way. Essentially, it's a mentoring, mastering sort of thing where you'd have like a master saddle maker, right? And he or she has apprentice saddle makers. And the art of that master saddle maker is, how well do I make new master saddle makers, right? Or how well do I grow my apprentices? And that's a set of behaviors that we sort of lost when we got to the Industrial Revolution, and it became all about widgets and 200 units a week and all that kind of thing. And that ability to be that crafty, inspiring mentor and know when to get out of the way, right, are just things we don't have in management today. Sometimes it gets called leadership, but that's not really leadership either, I don't think.
Right. No, and that's really interesting because it's like it's come back, kind of full circle, right? You went from it being there for when that master apprentice relationship, then as the industrial revolution kicks off, and now we're so focused, and we have been, and for so long in that era of productivity that we lacked the understanding, the vocabulary, the everything. We didn't, even though, I mean, well, you think about it, this really came out in what was it, the late 90s, early 2000s. It's not been that long. I mean, it's a fraction of the time that we've been doing this industrial revolution thing. So for centuries, we had that kind of mindset. And now, over just a couple of decades, we're now back in this environment, kind of in a way, where things are completely different. It's no longer just that sort of productivity. It's how do you kind of take care of the whole project beyond project. But I want to get into project management. But going back to your point here, where it really kind of is, how can you create? Let's go with a software developer, right? How can you how can you be kind of the master developer and help all these apprentices grow them and make so that they can then craft good software, right? So I think that you do a great job there, and I don't think a lot of people have given it that the right. I don't think they know that. I don't think people they've really come to that realization. Once you do, you're like, oh shit, that's right. We are thinking industrial, in an industrial way in the modern kind of internet age, right? So I
No,
love that
thank you.
you
Thank
brought
you
that
very much.
together for people because I think it's a really important distinction that people lack. And so you're banging your heads against the a wall that's no longer there, right? It just doesn't apply. So going into
Thank you.
project management, you do a great job in the book talking about it. I just kind of want to wind you up and let you go, if you will, on project management. So tell us, what is your take on project management? You run an agile agency, project management, which seems like it'd be right up your alley.
Yeah, and actually, I was for a good part of my career. Speaking of Genesis, I was a project manager. I didn't even want to be one because I'd been a programmer before, and I thought project managers were idiots. Actually, they would go around and try and tell me what to do, but they didn't even know what they were talking about because I was the programmer, right?
Mhm.
And yet, it paid well and had really reasonable working hours and the like. And especially me because I didn't want to do the job. I actually had the benefit of doing less of it, which my teams liked and everything like that. The thing I'll say is that, and I was very successful at the thing I go into in the book is that it's project management is very, very misunderstood. Project management works well in some situations, but it's probably not the situation you work in if you're a listener to this show. Project management works well when we're doing things that are very well understood, like building a house, right? One of the common examples I use, you bring in a project manager when you've got a blueprint and a plan and a plot of land you're going to do it on, wherever you're going to build it. And that project manager just connects the dot, but the blueprint already says what the house looks like. Okay. So that's not really, you can call it a project. I can call cleaning my office a project. Okay. But it's not really a project because I've cleaned my office before, right? And we built houses before, but most projects these days are doing something we haven't built before and trying to write a project plan for something we haven't done before is subject to this problem of ignorance. We can't plan the things we don't know we need to plan yet. Yet, here's the problem. The problem is that the managers in the organization will say to the project managers, where's my plan? And the project manager doesn't say, well, we don't know enough yet, which would be the accurate answer, right? Instead, they go, shit, I better get a plan together. Let's see what we know. I'll make a plan for that. And then everyone else sees that plan and says, cool, it's covered. We've got a plan. And you don't have a plan. What you do is you have worse than no plan. Because if you had no plan, you'd be going, okay, what else do we need to do? At least you'd be thinking about that. Once you have a plan, it creates myopia inside the managerial group. And so no one's looking for what we're missing. Everyone's like, well, it's going to be done in 9 weeks. That's what the schedule says, right? And in fact, it's not done in 9 weeks. In fact, project management fails so badly. You would not go to a dentist or a car repair person if they had the track record that project management does. Like literally, if you took your car to a car repair person, and I have had these people before, and like only 30% of the time it came back truly fixed, you'd be completely miserable. And my question is, if project management ends up being misleading in these contexts, right? And in fact it starts misleading everyone else as well, then why do we rely on it so heavily? We rely on it because it tells a story that it does work, and it doesn't. Okay, that's I can tell you literally every company we work with, project driven organizations, I come in and I say, what's your project rework rate? Project rework is when we said we'd have it done in 10 weeks, but it really took us 13 weeks, or 1,000 hours worth of work, 1,400 hours instead. And everyone says 20, 30, 40%. Even some won't talk about the number. It's so big, right? And I say, do you have project managers? And they're like, oh, yeah, we've got tons of project managers. I say, okay, well, that's not working real well, is it? And I'm not saying that there's no value for a project manager at all. What I'm saying is that we tend to over rely on project management, and it's just one form. I talk about 4 different types of managers that we over rely on rather than relying on just the team being smart and figuring things out as well.
So how does an organization, when they've got let's not even call it they've got a project, how do you approach it then? If you can't go to a project manager and say, hey, plan out the project, right? What's the solution?
Well, it sort of ties together into interesting thing. I don't know if we'll have time to go into it all the way, but the 4 key managerial moments. If you decompose this and look at the research, and we've proven this now with several hundred organizations, the problems start very early. One is because we're doing something new. A lot of times, even the people who we're doing it for don't understand it that well. The managers on our side don't understand it well, and certainly the team can't understand it very well either. And that starts with the idea of the why. Why are we doing it? How does it fit into the big picture? All that kind of thing. Amazingly, and we teach how to do why. It's one of the 4 things we teach. When we demonstrate this by showing a company how to do the why, everyone's looking around at each other going, oh, I didn't know that. I didn't know that. Oh, really? No, that won't work. And they have these conversations that realize they'd launched a project with just a wing and a prayer that this thing would get done, and hadn't really ever gotten to the spot of truly understanding it. And until you understand the why and then what we call the what, which is the actual scope, and it turns out that teams, as everyone's so optimistic about the project, it's just hilarious. But there's one group of people that are not optimistic about projects. And what you want is people who aren't optimistic about projects that you don't know things about. And those are the team members, because the team members have been to that rodeo before. Yeah. They've they've lived this world where a project is handed to them. It's poorly defined, and someone says you have 10 weeks, hurry up. And then they get interrupted all the time by managers, and they're trying to get things done. And as they do it, they discover things that were never talked about, and surprises, and people tell them to fix it anyways. These are people that are very skeptical about whether your project is well enough defined. And what we do is we show organizations how to put it back in their hands and let them define it and lead that conversation. It's ridiculously empowering. It's really, really cool.
How do you do that? What's that look like? I know we don't have we don't have hours, to kind of dig into all the details, but the kind of the general overview, for people so they kind of understand it a little bit.
I think the simplest thing to say is that when managers say, I've explained it to someone, you can assume it has not been understood. The speed of explaining is way different than the speed of understanding. And if I'm explaining to a room of 10 people, my sense of how fast they should absorb things and how well they understand it. I used to do this. I'll give you my quick anecdote. I would do these briefings. We would bring in a new project and I'd get the team together, and I would have PowerPoint slides and spreadsheets they could look at later and a thing on the file server. And I would bam, bam, bam. I'd go through everything they completely needed to know in 30 minutes. I'd leave a couple of minutes at the end for questions. I'd say, any questions? No questions. I'm like, cool. I must have done an awesome job. And then during the next 3 months, I would get questions constantly. And I'd be thinking, weren't you listening to what I said in that briefing? And the answer is yes, they were listening, but they weren't understanding. So what you need to do is actually turn the conversation around and have them create a learning conversation, which is questions, right?
Yeah.
And the easiest way to do it is to say something very simple like this. We've got a new project. What do you folks want to know about it? And I'm not going to talk except to answer a question, a specific question. What's the project called? It's called XYZ. What else do you want to know? And what I do is I engage them in a learning discussion, right? Rather than just prove that I can recite a bunch of stuff real fast.
Yeah, I love that. So just taking that software analogy, because I think you're constantly, or often, I should say, not constantly, but you're often in the software world creating something that's never been done before, right? You're doing,
Yeah.
kind of. I mean, software's a fun one because on the one hand, we've written programs before. Yep, got it. So I started writing when I was in code when I was 12, and professionally when I was 13, and I spent my nights and weekends slinging code for a bunch of companies, and so this is a world where I'm very familiar, and it's like, well, it's an interesting problem, right? Because yes, if we've done a project, we've created something similar, but we've never done this. What you're trying to do here is something new. And so at best, you've got a best guess on, it's sometimes you get in there and you're like, how do I solve this problem? And it takes a while and it takes more resources. So is the process, is this a matter of realigning people's expectations so they better understand that, hey, we're doing something that's never been done before. We're looking at this ballpark of getting it done here. And we're going to come in somewhere around here, but it's never been done before. So there's no way to map out a precise, exact roadmap because nobody's ever traveled here before. We might find that there's a cliff that we have to then kind of circumnavigate, we got to go around this somehow, or maybe we've got to figure out a way to go over the ravine, right? Is it a matter of that, or is there a more precise model? What would you say?
You're asking a very, very good question. Obviously, a guy who's done software before. So I'm gonna touch on software agile real quick, okay? Because the idea of software agile relied on a problem that was a very, very different problem than the one we're talking about. The idea there was we're doing this 200 man or person year project, right? And even if you could write a specification, it would take you 2 years to write it, and then nobody would read it, right? So, in a sense, the project was almost completely unknowable. So, the best thing to do was just say, hey, by the way, everyone, this is an unknowable project. We're just going to plow into it and do the best we can, which was way better than actually the original way of writing a specification. Now, but your projects these days are nothing like that. Okay. The today's projects are very knowable, except that they always have some uncertainty, some missing pieces in them. And in fact, your point is great, is that we do know how to develop software. We've just never done this one before. We actually know things that may go wrong because the same things go wrong a lot of times, right? And we may know that there's information missing and we can assume, well, we'll get that later. The idea that we can identify what we do know and also, more importantly, what we don't know right now, that's actually solves about 80% of the problem. If stakeholders realize, if your customer or whoever you're doing this for and your managers realize, yeah, we pretty much got this project down, but there are 17 open issues on this project, right? Then all of a sudden it's a different conversation. It's like, well, when issue number 14 gets resolved, that's obviously going to take another 2 weeks worth of work. And you don't need to do this all or nothing. It's completely not understandable, so it's not schedulable. It just sort of loosen the crowd up, if you will, right? And this goes back to that other thing I said about project management, which is the idea that that if it's on the plan, it's what we're going to do, and we'll be all set. Or look, department managers overestimate how easy it is to get things done, because if they did them, which they can't because they're a department manager, it would go faster, but they even overestimate how fast it would go for them. There are all these little biases, and putting some reality in the room works really, really well.
I love that. I think you hit on a point about communication and documentation, how that slows down
You did read the book. Awesome.
I did. I did. No, I thought it was fantastic. And I think it's a really important point, because that even applies on the smallest level. Like, so many people like texting. If you take it, okay, great. And they text and they instant message. You're spending an hour having a conversation via text and instant message that could have happened in 5 minutes over the phone. What are you doing? And this is just consumed resources. You've spent an hour typing it out. That's ridiculous, right? And so I think that's one kind of real world example that people often fail. And Slack is so popular, Teams is so popular. There's a time and a place, but honestly, I think people end up, just like you overmanage, right? And you've got all this. This helps add to that. Hey, look at all the managing we're doing. And you've got it documented, all the conversation. It's in Slack, it's in Teams, and it's all been there. But you didn't get anything done today, because what could have happened in the course of 20 minutes was 5, Teams conversations all day. What? And so I think you hit a really important point there in the book, but you don't just apply it to that. I mean, I think people should apply that to everything. And you did such a great job in the book, not to kind of speak for you, but I mean, I thought it was just so powerful. And I think so many people miss that, that I just wanted to say.
Thank you again. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it's a great point that more people really need to apply to their daily lives, and more. You hit so many great points in the book that we really just, we're running out of time and don't. And I would love to just hit a bunch of them. But for anybody who hasn't already, Unmanaged it's worth picking up, and it's a great read, full of lots of really good real world examples, which I loved. The stories were great; they all applied, and some really great points there. And that, again, I don't want to be the speaker here. I just want to kind of squeeze that in there, because Jack, it's a great book, and I think I wish you all the success in the world on it, because I think it's fantastic, and every company and manager should have a copy of this, and should kind of incorporate it into the way they work. So I want to put that out there, of course. Now, for those who haven't already, where can they get a copy of your book, and where can they find out more about you and Agile Agency?
So, of course, the jungle, right? Amazon, the source of all books these days, it seems. We're also on Barnes & Noble, just in case. I ran into someone the other day who said, I don't do Amazon. Cool. Okay. Barnes & Noble. You can always shoot us a note if you need a snail mail copy or something like that as well. The Agency Agile, all one word, AgencyAgile.com is our organization. You can find me on LinkedIn, Jack Skeels on LinkedIn. Happy to hear from you and shoot a connection, and any questions you have and the like. Happy to, once you've taken a look at the book, if you have other questions, happy to talk to you about that as well.
Fantastic. Well, it's been a pleasure, Jack. Thanks for coming on. And yeah, till next time.
Yeah, Matthew, thank you so very much. And, wow, what great questions and what a great discussion. I really appreciate it. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Jack. My pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the Cyber Business Podcast. We'll see you again next time, and be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes.